Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Trepang2 for PC. This is a first-person shooter developed by Trepang Studios and published by Team 17 that was released on June 21st of this year, and thus far it's been very well received, being seen as something of a spiritual successor to the likes of the original F.E.A.R, although I have a feeling that for a lot of people that set the bar unreasonably high, for reasons that I'll explain more throughout the rest of this review. But the simple fact of the matter is I've been looking forward to this releasing ever since I started messing around with the demo back a couple of years ago at this point, and since I've been keeping my eye on the development, I've been seeing it shape up quite nicely. So what's the end result like? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on Unreal Engine 4 and generally makes quite good use of the engine. It's certainly not what we would describe as a AAA standard of fidelity, but the modeling is quite well done, the texture quality is good, the animations are generally pretty smooth, and the weapon handling animations in particular are quite well done. But the real star of the show here is the effects, most notably in terms of particle effects and the screen effects that trigger when you do things like go into focus mode. There is an absolute ton of special effects going on at any given moment in this game, and they make the game look very stylish. And when you blast your way through an area, it's creating absolute havoc, both from the fact that you're blasting enemies into meaty chunks, as well as the fact that you're just having tons of particle effects and crazy visual effects going off all at any given moment. There is a problem with this, however. As cool as that looks, it also makes it very difficult to tell what's going on a lot of the time. Now, given that this game is trying to imitate the visual and mechanical stylings of F.E.A.R, I understand why they did it this way, but F.E.A.R didn't really obscure the gameplay from the player quite as much as Trepang2 does. And I have a feeling a lot of that has to do with more engine limitations than anything else. There's just certain things that are hard baked into Unreal Engine at this point that can just reduce the visuals down to kind of an absolute mess at times, and you need to be very careful about how you implement those things if you're going to maintain visual readability while also having impressive visual effects. It's a very delicate balancing act, and there's not really very many studios that can actually pull that off. Epic included, I might add. And certainly not the very small team that worked on Trepang2. They did a pretty good job with what they had, of course. It's just that sometimes when you get into the really heavy combat, it just gets a bit difficult to tell what's going on. You can usually work around that, but sometimes it can be a bit frustrating, and that is something that you need to be aware of if you're going to be going into this thing. That said, visual noise aside, they have done an excellent job with things like the lighting being very moody and atmospheric, as well as the just sheer glory of blasting an enemy with a shotgun and turning them into a bunch of meaty chunks, organs, and fine mist, which of course makes the weapon feel much more satisfying. Then you move over into sound design, and that's where things get a bit messier. On the one hand, the sound effects themselves are all very well done for the most part. They've got some nice punchy weapon sounds, some punchy explosion sounds. The shotgun in particular sounds very nice. And while the body and gore physics tend to glitch out a fair bit and cause a whole bunch of annoying repeated sound effects, the actual sounds of enemies getting blasted apart and thrown across the room and such are all quite satisfying as well. All of these sound effects are accompanied by a soundtrack that vacillates between being weird, experimental, and interesting, like the main track Serenity, to very, very repetitive in the case of most of the soundtrack, actually. It's not bad necessarily, but while the initial heaviness does give you a bit of an adrenaline rush, after a while of having very repetitive sounding tracks, it just wears on you. So your mileage may vary on that, let's put it that way. Then of course there's the voice acting, where you have only a handful of voice actors, and about half of the characters in the game are voiced by Gianni Matrigano. And sure, they all do a decent enough job with what they're given, but the main problem there isn't so much the acting as it is the writing. But I'll talk about that more in just a moment. For now, understand that for the most part, they've done a very good job with the presentation here, It's just that certain aspects of it are a bit disappointing, namely things like the repetitive music, as well as how much the screen gets obscured when you get into heavy firefights. But of course, what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is barely even a thing. You play as Subject 106, who starts the game off handcuffed to a chair and being forced to watch some sort of brainwashing video, when all of a sudden a mysterious agent busts into the room, shoots the screen, and lets you loose, effectively. From there, you end up fighting your way through the facility and end up finding out that you have been captured by agents of the Horizon Corporation, and once you make it out of the facility, you find that you are being rescued by members of Task Force 27, whose entire purpose is to shut down the Horizon Corporation in the most violent manner possible. To that end, 106 goes around the world on various missions and blasts the living crap out of any Horizon forces that get in his way, eventually working up to a full-on assault on Horizon's headquarters. Along the way, you find out that Horizon has been meddling in things beyond their comprehension, experimenting with all manner of anomalous materials and organisms and just anomalies in general, all with absolutely no regard for human life whatsoever, meaning that the experiments have turned absolutely horrific, and they are all in service of what Horizon says is the betterment of humanity, but it's extremely difficult to see where that might actually be the case. As you go through the various missions in the game, you'll find a whole lot of intel items that expand more on what's going on in those areas, and you'll gradually get filled in on what's going on with 106 himself, because it's not just the fact that he's a super soldier that's important. It's also the fact that literally everyone refers to him as 106 and not an actual name or even just a call sign or anything, just the number 106. And that he's getting odd snippets here and there of references to the cycle and how to break it and things like that, implying a much greater mystery that will be unveiled as you continue throughout the game. There are a few problems with the way all of this is set up and the way it all plays out. The first of them is that the mission structure is very disjointed, in the sense that you go to the hideout between every single mission, regardless of which mission that is, you go to a map table, and then you select which mission you want to go on next. Now, in theory, they could set this up in a sort of vignette storytelling style, and that would make sense for a broken up mission structure like that, but that's not what they do. Whenever you go into a mission, whatever you're doing within the scope of that mission is entirely contained within that mission. So while you'll be encountering things like Horizon soldiers and special forces and such throughout the entire game, when you go into, say, a Horizon laboratory and you start running into horrible abominations, the only place you're going to encounter them is in that one mission. On one hand, that does set the mission apart from all of the other ones. It makes it relatively unique. On the other hand, you're not getting an actual progression of enemy types, of really any kind of actual storyline or anything like that. You're just going from one disjointed mission to the other, all of which are working towards the same goal of eliminating the Horizon Corporation, but you're not actually getting any real story progression out of it. And unfortunately, they don't really tie any of the missions together until you get to the very end of the game, and then when they do try to tie it all together, it's a very clumsy and haphazardly thrown together way of doing it. The simple fact of the matter is that Trepang2 doesn't really have a story as much as it has a few ideas that the developers didn't seem to know what to do with, so they said, okay, we'll just set that aside for now, let's focus on the gameplay mechanics, let's get all of those shored up, and then we can come back to story later. And so they went and got the gameplay shored up, and when it came time to finish up the storyline, they just had a massive oh shit moment and threw it all in a blender and hoped it would work. The end result of all of that is you have ideas in this game that work perfectly fine in the moments that they come up, But when you try to tie them all together, when you try to tie all of the plot elements, all of the story beats in Trepang2 together, you just end up with an incoherent mess, and no amount of collectible intel items that supposedly fill out the storyline actually helps with that. In fact, if anything, those intel items only leave you with more questions. And because there is so little to latch onto with regards to storyline in this game, by the time you get to the very end of it, and the mystery is revealed and they throw the plot twists at you, you're just not gonna care. And since you're not gonna be able to care about what's going on in the storyline, that means the entirety of the experience of Trepang2 falls to its gameplay. And that's where things get interesting. Because, as I mentioned before, this is a game that is styled after the likes of the original F.E.A.R. This is accomplished through a combination of bullet time mechanics, where you have a meter that builds up as you kill enemies, and then you can use that to go into a focus mode that slows down time and lets you move around and get those exact precise shots you need, while also throwing a whole bunch of extra visual effects on for good measure. And you can combine this with doing things like throwing grenades at enemies and then shooting those grenades when they're right in the middle of a group of them and causing absolute havoc, or just smacking enemies around with the rather damaging melee attacks. They do try to differentiate themselves a bit from F.E.A.R. in the sense that you have things like the slide, which you'd think would be just some advanced movement, but it is actually required for dealing with certain enemies, because when you slide into an enemy, it sends them ragdolling, so you can send an enemy flying and then blast the living crap out of them. Very useful for dealing with shield-bearing enemies when you don't have any grenades or just don't want to waste any grenades. There's also a rather limited stealth system in the sense that if you're in shadows, you are much more difficult for enemies to see, and so you can use that to sneak up behind enemies by crouching and moving quietly, and then you can grab enemies from behind and use them as bullet shields, or prime the grenades on them and chuck them at enemies, or just chuck them at enemies in general, or you can just do a silent kill on that enemy in general and then move on to the next one. Although it is worth noting that you can also grab enemies in the midst of combat as well, as long as you're behind them. It's not something that's exclusive to stealth. In addition to simply sneaking up behind enemies and whacking them upside the head, or grabbing them and then snapping their neck or whatever, you can also take out enemies from a distance using suppressed weapons, although before you have access to the weapon attachments that allow you to just attach a suppressor to one of the weapons that you bring into a level, you have to find a weapon that already has a suppressor attached somewhere in the level, and that's a bit more of a tricky proposition there, because more often than not, there's just going to be weapons with no attachments at all. So your options for taking enemies out while you're trying to sneak around are fairly limited, and to make matters a bit more tricky, the only option you have for lighting up the way in front of you is a flashlight, and enemies can see that. And since there's not really any tangible benefit for sneaking around versus going loud, I found that most of the time I just completely ignored the stealth system in favor of, shall we say, quite violently redecorating the Horizon Corporation's various facilities, and of course the cultist facilities on one or two particular levels. And this was accomplished through some absolutely fantastic gunplay, where every single weapon feels useful, no matter what it is, throughout the entire game. And as you might expect from a game that was heavily inspired by F.E.A.R., the shotgun is immensely satisfying in this regard, where you just reduce enemies into meaty chunks and organs and fine mist in very short order with them. But then they take these weapons a step further, because it's not just enough to have, say, a submachine gun that you can happen to attach a suppressor to, or an assault rifle that you can do the same to, or a DMR, or marksman rifle that you can attach a suppressor to. No. Every single weapon has various other attachments that you can apply to them, like laser sights that will be visible to enemies, but will give you a bonus to accuracy, or in the case of something like the bolt launcher, you can convert it from firing a triple shot of basically sticky grenades to firing a single projectile that will then pin enemies to walls, or you can change the shotguns from just the absolute force of nature they already are to fire incendiary rounds, thus setting enemies on fire on top of doing massive damage. As if that weren't enough, about halfway through the game you'll gain access to the dual-wield serum, which will allow you to dual-wield most of the weapons. Dual-wielding incendiary shotguns is immensely satisfying, to say the least. And when you bring all that together, you end up with combat that is absolutely glorious. When you're going into focus mode, kicking in that slow-mo to get those precise shots off, throwing grenades, shooting them out of the air, grabbing enemies, throwing them into other enemies, and then blasting the whole pile of them with incendiary shotguns, and just utterly eviscerating everything in front of you, it can be incredibly satisfying. And if you play it on the higher difficulties, it is actually quite challenging as well. Even if it is only because the enemies do an awful lot of damage to you and you just had to play it a lot more carefully. But I played through the entire game on the hard difficulty, and while there were certainly some moments that were a bit challenging, for the most part it was very manageable, and I got through the game in right around 6 hours. But that's doing every single mission, including all of the main missions and the side missions. And this brings me to something that is very important. I've already mentioned with regards to the story how everything is rather disjointed, where you're just going on pretty much self-contained missions and there's not really much of a story. But that's not all. There are only 5 story missions in the entire game, and 6 side missions. And those side missions are all just variations of go into these combat arenas and fight off waves of enemies. Some of them require you to go to certain locations and then interact with a terminal or something and start a download or whatever. And then you have to defend that position from the enemies that disrupt the connection, but it's still a wave-based format. And then other ones are just basic wave formats where the enemies just come at you in waves and you destroy every single one of them until eventually the next wave spawns. There's just not much to them, and the intel items in there don't do anything to help the story either. They're much like the ones in the main story missions, just self-contained and kind of worthless. The only thing that is really important about the various side missions is the various weapon attachments that you can get by going into those levels and picking them up, and then those will unlock those weapon attachments for the rest of the campaign. So obviously you have incentive from a mechanical standpoint of getting all of the weapon attachments to go and complete these missions, but that's kind of it really. They don't fill in any gaps in the storyline, they don't introduce you to any new mechanics or any new enemy types or anything like that. They just rehash enemies you've fought before. They're all in the pretty much exact same format with some very slight variations, and you just don't care what's going on narrative-wise in those missions, so there are only 2 reasons you would go on them. First is just to get those weapon attachments, and the second is just because you happen to enjoy the core combat loop and you just want more of it. And funnily enough, if you just want the experience of going on the side missions, you can just go into the hideout and go to the combat simulator and you get exactly the same experience, but of course without there being any weapon parts or intel items to pick up. It's just the combat arenas themselves in the basic wave-based format. If you want more substantial first-person shooter gameplay, then you're going to go on the main missions, and even there, the main thing that's going to keep you interested in them is the core combat loop. And that ultimately brings me to the main question of Trepang2. Is that core combat loop enough to hold up the entire experience? Because that's really what it comes down to. The stealth is almost an afterthought, really. The few times the game tries to introduce some horror elements, they just don't work very well. Not to mention the fact that they feel like they were just included as something of an afterthought because, hey, this game's styled after F.E.A.R, and F.E.A.R had spooky moments, so I guess we've got to include those in our game too, even if they don't really work. And then, of course, there's the story, which is just an absolute mess throughout, and it frankly only gets worse the further you get in. So that means you're going to latch on to the one thing that is actually incredibly good in this game, which is the core combat loop. Which is a very satisfying combat loop that is enough to keep you going through the entire game. But as good as that combat loop is, there are some faults in Trepang2 it just can't make up for. The first of these is that the boss fights are just plain bad. You go up against massive bullet sponges, they take forever to bring down, and they're just not satisfying to fight at all. They're not even particularly difficult fights, they just take a long time to get through, and it turns what should be a really fun, satisfying combat loop into a total slog. And the second main problem is that they more or less abandon the core combat loop at the very end of the game. Now, to give you more context would require me to spoil the ending for you, and I'm not going to do that considering the game is brand new. But the short version is that after fighting through the absolute gauntlet that is the final mission, you lose the ability to do all of the cool shit that you've been doing throughout the entire game up to that point. No more throwing grenades and shooting them out of the air. No more grabbing enemies and using them as bullet shields or throwing them into other enemies. No more dual wielding, none of that. The only things you're left with are the focus mode and being able to shoot one gun at a time. And that's how they have you fight the final boss. Not only is it just an absolutely terrible way to end the game, it's also just utterly baffling. You get all these cool things you can do throughout the entire game, and then they throw you up against the final boss and say, yeah, you can shoot at it and that's it. No, you can't even throw grenades at it. You just have to shoot it with your basic gun until it eventually falls over. Have fun. Needless to say, that final boss fight is the absolute worst boss fight in the entire game. It is not fun at all, and by the time you're done with it, you're not saying, hell yeah, I'm a badass, you're saying, oh, thank fuck it's over. And that's just a really disappointing note for the game to go out on. And that brings me back to the main question here. Is that core combat loop enough to hold up the entire experience of Trepang2? Unfortunately, the answer there is barely. It is enough to hold the experience enough for you to be able to get through the entire game, and you'll probably still enjoy the core combat loop after you've gotten through it. But without enough story to really hold the game together, and without enough variation in the moment-to-moment gameplay, it just doesn't have the same kind of lasting appeal that you would get out of the game that it is so heavily styled after, the original F.E.A.R. Sure, that game has its problems, but it does have lasting appeal. And that's something that Trepang2 just doesn't have. It's got a really solid core combat loop that is very fun, but without enough quality in the other elements to support it, it just ends up being wasted potential overall. And as such, even though that core combat loop is really fun and satisfying, unfortunately Trepang2 just falls into the 2.5 out of 5 category on my scale. I know a lot of people misconstrue that as, oh, that means the game sucks. It doesn't. It means that the overall experience is underwhelming. It does have one thing that it does really, really well, and that is the core combat loop. But most of the rest of the game actually holds that really fun core combat back and makes the entire experience ultimately just a bit disappointing overall. That's not to say that you shouldn't play Trepang2 at all. A 2.5 on my scale does not mean the game is completely irredeemable, and if they make a sequel and they address the problems that were present in the original Trepang2, then I could very easily see it jumping up to a 3.5, 4, maybe even a 4.5 or higher depending on how well they nail the rest of the elements. But Trepang2, in its current state as I'm reviewing it, is a 2.5 out of 5. That does not mean don't play it at all. That means heavily temper your expectations going into this. Do not expect it to be the F.E.A.R. sequel we never got. Expect it to take a lot of design cues from F.E.A.R., but not really nailing the entire experience. And I would definitely recommend waiting for a discount on it as well. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in later videos.